Today's lecture is over Chapter 19, Section 1, the objectives. Number 1, examine East Africa's history as a continental crossroads. Number 2, describe the disruptive effects of colonialization on East Africa. Number 3, analyze East Africa's economies of farming and tourism. Number 4, describe the cultures of East Africa's major ethnic groups. Number 5, examine the state of healthcare in East Africa. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at kind of why we're talking about this section. East Africa is known as the cradle of humanity. East Africa's location has made it a trading center. Now when we go ahead and we look at the map here of Africa, what we're going to see is that the continent is large. It's really larger than what people see when they see maps. If you look at the world map on the back of the page, what you're going to realize is that the map kind of disfigures some things, and it looks like Africa is about the same size as South America. Looks like it's about relatively close to that of Europe, when in fact this continent is much larger. If we just go ahead and we look at South America here compared to Africa, it's relatively a large continent. What we're looking at today is we're going to kind of go ahead and we're going to look at this East African areas kind of around here, and what we see and what we think might be a couple different things. First of all, we're going to look at Europe up here, and we're going to see that Africa is very much a neighbor to the south, and then you have your Asia countries that are going to go ahead and it's going to be a neighbor as well. This is going to affect a lot of things. First of all, you remember the Europeans, specifically Portugal, are going around the southern tip of Africa. They're coming out the other side, and then they're going to go to India for trade. So this makes it so that a lot of the west and the south Africa countries are going to be kind of those Western European countries. We also see kind of, if we look in here, we can also see Northern Africa is going to be connected to Europe by the Mediterranean Sea. Now, if we look to the east here of Africa, we're going to see places like Egypt, Sudan, all these countries in this area here, and they're going to have a very close relationship with this peninsula right here. The Arabian Peninsula has, and unless something major changes, will always be Islam, and they're going to be people that are going to be Muslim. And so what we see is that these areas right in here, Egypt, Libya, really Sudan, down to South Sudan, even down to Kenya, we're going to see these countries as having a Islamic kind of background. Now that's not always the case, but for the better part it's pretty much true. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look and we're going to see really why is this area the way that it is. First of all, like we said, prehistoric remains are going to be found in the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. These are some of the oldest prehistoric remains that we've ever found, and so what that means is that these remains show us that these are some of the first people, or some of the oldest people that we have record of that are actually going to live in this area. It is a trading coast. The region is going to include Burundi, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Seychelles, Somalia, Tanzania, Uganda. All these countries again are going to go ahead and they're going to be on this kind of eastern side right here, and what you're going to see is that they develop into really a region right there. In the 100 AD, the Ethiopian civilization of Aksum is going to be trading with Egypt and Rome, and so what we see all the way back over almost 2,000 years ago is we see Africa trading with really all over, and what we see then is that they become very important for the trade of a lot of people. 600s, the Arabs and Persians and Indians trade in this region as well. Important Tanzania trading city of Kalawa is going to flourish. Areas becomes a cultural crossroads, becomes good ideas, people start to spread, and what you're going to see then is that this area becomes kind of that cultural crossroads that we've talked about. Now, something we have not talked about but could not be more important. What we're going to see is that in the 1800s, the Europeans are really going to put an emphasis on Africa. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at this map right here. And what we see is that it's a Berlin Conference. And the Berlin Conference is really easy actually to think about and to know about. And what we see is is that Africa, this is a picture of Africa right here. And as you could see, we could possibly draw some lines, and we call these political boundaries. We could maybe draw some of these political boundaries kind of dependent on really geographic features. You can, and again, I'm just kind of drawing and playing around a little bit here, but as you could see, this could be a very easy way to basically make these political lines. And again, we're looking mostly at geographic features more than anything else. Now, this would be a good idea, and this could be something that could have been very easy. What you can also look at is you might have a group, and we're just going to put a plus and a circle in this. So what we have is that these are going to represent types of tribes, and so what we see is that some these tribes are going to go ahead and they're going to be kind of spread out. And again, the pluses are going to represent one group of people, and the circles are going to represent a different group of people and kind of where they live. Now, the thing that I'm trying to show here is that these are kind of all over spread out. And what happened was that with the Berlin Conference, they decided that they were going to go ahead. I'm going to change the color here. They're going to go ahead and they're going to draw political boundaries. And what they did is that they didn't really care how they were making those political boundaries. What they were doing is that they were saying, well, this looks kind of right, and this is going to look kind of right, and this is going to look kind of right, and this is going to look kind of right. But as you can see with the pluses and the circles, is that in this area right here, we have connected two tribes that might absolutely hate each other. And so what we see with this Berlin Conference, and this is where I say that it just could not be more important, is that the Europeans are going to come in and they're basically going to divide Africa up based upon what they think is the best. The Africans who are saying, hey, you know what, this isn't going to work, basically their input is denied, and they kind of go out and basically just kind of get told that they have to follow this. This is one of the most important reasons why Africa continues to have problems, continues to have countries that are at war. If you look at the long tradition of African countries, a lot of it stems back, a lot of their problems stem back to the fact that in this Berlin Conference they divide Africa up. And again, I'll go ahead and I'll show you what the actual lines are right here. But you can see that some of these right here are just drawn basically because of longitude and latitude. And what you see is that could not be worse for these countries, because they're basically pitting them as a country against their arch rivals, which they can't stand. Ethiopia does avoid colonization. Emperor Menelik II is going to protect Ethiopia from the Italian invasion in 1896. So they become kind of off on their own. What you see is that these countries are independent by 1970, but many of the countries are going to have civil wars and disputes. What you also see is that these colonial boundaries are going to miss ethnic groups, which is what we just kind of drew up there. And so there's going to be internal conflict. So you're constantly seeing these countries in civil wars. You're constantly seeing these countries that aren't able to really develop their countries because there's so much internal fighting, way more than we have in the United States and more than they have in Europe for sure. Now, what we see in East Africa is that they're going to grow cash crops for direct sale. This is basically going to be coffee, tea, and sugar, for example, but this is basically going to be crops that they take up farmland to grow. Usually when you see cash crops, this is what the entire country is doing. The country really puts a lot of investment into these cash crops right here, but they take up a lot of farmland to grow crops that really don't make very much money. People leave the farms, and what they're going to do is that they're going to go ahead and they're going to go to the cities. You guys remember this is defined as urbanization. And what we see in Africa, though, is that this rapid urban growth is going to strain resources and also agricultural production. And what it does is it makes it so that a lot of these countries, cities are going to be poor. Now, tourism is something that's a little bit interesting in Africa. Wildlife parks in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania attract tourism and income. These are things like you can go ahead and you can have an African safari right here where you actually just drive around and look at these animals. And yes, hunting is going to be kind of a controversial thing in this area, but it's very, very good for the economy right there. For example, if you guys recall, there was Cecil the lion that was shot and killed, and a lot of people had problems with that. But what they don't realize is that a lot of those countries are very poor, and there's some rules that actually state that a lot of those animals have to be left there. So, for example, if you were to kill an elephant, that might feed a village for 3 to 6 months, depending on the village. They can use the bones, and people that go and shoot those animals are going to make lots of money for the people that actually are taking them out and working with them. Also, those African elephants, if you don't know and you want to do a little research on them, they actually struggle because they're so big, and what they'll do is stampede those cash crops, and so people in some areas of the world are actually trying to bring them in and shoot those animals. The point that I'm trying to make is that this is part of the tourism of Africa. It's a little bit more safari, a little bit more hunting and things like that, and then what we see is that the need for food and farmland is creating a problem for these wildlife reserves because they're basically taking the land that they so desperately need. Now, maintaining traditional cultures is another issue that becomes kind of important here. 160 different ethnic regions or ethnic groups in this region. The Maasai live in a river valley grasslands of Kenya and Tanzania. They're going to herd livestock, farm, make intricate beadwork, jewelry. They'll wear calfskin, buffalo hide clothes, robes, things like that. The Kikuyu is going to be a large Kenyan group, ethnic group that's centered around Mount Kenya. 1950s, they're going to organize against the Mau Mau Society to fight the British. And so what we see is that the Mau Mau Rebellion is actually very famous because the British are going to kill about 11,000 people in the 1950s. And remember, this is just at the end of apartheid, which is what we're going to talk about later in South Africa. And a lot of people are saying that the British need to get out of Africa, and this becomes a major problem worldwide. Now, last slide here that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the healthcare in Africa. Africa is devastated by the AIDS pandemic. Pandemic is defined by disease outbreak and a large population over a wide area. What we see is that AIDS is going to be caused by HIV. More people have HIV than AIDS, so AIDS numbers are misleading. This is one of the things as geographers we hope that we're teaching you is to be able to look at certain numbers. But these numbers, like it says here, they can be very misleading, because what you can say is you can say, okay, in the 1990s, the number of people that had AIDS was much, much lower than it is now. We must be doing a good job. Well, what is actually happening is that the people that are dying have died of AIDS, and there might be just a little bit of gap, and we might see a major explosion. So you're going to see that these numbers are not as good as what we actually have them to be. Some African countries are going to hide the scope of the disease to make themselves look better. Experts fear that most affected areas of the world could lose 10 to 20% of their population. That's a staggering number. We're going to talk more about the healthcare problem in Africa in later sections, because it really is a problem for the entire continent. This is the end of chapter 19, section 1. Please make sure that you complete your assessments at this time.